What's typical talk at primary school? Let's describe the stages of typical language development with examples of what you might see and hear at school or at home. Language development in the primary years steadily builds on the solid foundations that are established during the early years. Children's attention, listening, understanding, vocabulary, speech, grammar, storytelling, and conversations all develop further in terms of skills, knowledge, and complexity. Children develop at different rates, and we're going to talk about what to expect at different ages. Although this isn't an assessment, the information could help you to identify children who are not developing language skills as expected. Children with additional English as an additional language are at the same risk of speech, language, and communication needs as any other child. However, this can be more difficult to identify. For a child that's 4 to 5 years, their attention, listening, and understanding, they know to look at who's talking and think about what they're saying. They listen to and understand instructions about what they are doing without needing to look up. They understand 2 to 3 part spoken instructions. For example, finish your picture, then sit on the carpet and look at the book. They can answer a how or a why question. For example, why do we need sun hats on? To stop the sun burning our face. For 4 to 5 year olds, their vocabulary, they understand a range of related words to describe concepts. For example, soon, early and late, soft, hard and smooth. They know words can be put into groups and can give common examples in them. For example, animals, dog, cat, horse. They use words more specifically to make the meaning clearer. For example, I saw a funny monkey. It was a spider monkey. At 4 to 5 years, for speech sounds, grammar, and sentence building, they say words clearly, although they may struggle with a few complex speech sounds, consonant blends, or words with lots of syllables. For example, wabbit for rabbit, bow for blow, sketty for spaghetti. They use well-formed sentences. For example, I played with Zoe in the park. But they might have some errors. For example, I falled down. They join phrases with words such as if, because, so, and could. At 4 to 5 years, for verbal storytelling and narrative, they list events with some detail. For example, I went to Nanny's, I had fat chips for tea, I play games on the pooter. They retell favourite stories, for example, using some of their own words. For example, and she said, what a nice mouth you got, and the wolf said, I can eat you, gulp. They describe events, but not always joined together or in the right order. For example, I went on the top of the bus with Dad, that big slide is scary, we taped the ball as well. For 4 to 5 year olds, conversations and social interaction, they confidently start and take part in individual and group conversations. They join in and organise cooperative role play with friends and can pretend to be someone else talking. And they use language to ask, negotiate, give opinions and discuss ideas and feelings. For example, are we going to Nana's today? Can I take Teddy with me? He will be sad by himself. For children at 5 to 7 years of age, for their attention, listening and understanding, they start to ignore unimportant information. They are aware when a message is unclear and comment or ask for explanation. They understand complex 2 to 3 part instructions. For example, finish your picture from yesterday, then with a partner choose one of the topic books and talk about it quietly on the carpet. At 5 to 7 years old, for their vocabulary, they compare words, the way they look, sound or mean. For example, there are 2 words see at the beach and you see with your eyes. They can guess the word from clues or give others clues using shape, size, function, etc. They use newly learned words in a specific and appropriate way. For example, Dad, you know when you have lots of lions together, it is called a pride of lions. For 5 to 7-year-olds, in terms of their speech sounds, grammar and sentence building, their speech is clear with occasional errors, especially with consonant blends. They have a good knowledge of sounds in words. They ask lots of questions to find out specific information, including how and why. They use different ways to join phrases to help explain or justify an event. For example, I'm older than you, so I will go first. At 5 to 7 years of age, for verbal storytelling and narrative, they tell stories that set the scene, have a basic plot and a sequence of events. They begin to be aware of what the listener already knows, and they can check. For example, you know where I live, right? Well, in that big house by the shop. They accurately predict what will happen in a story. At 5 to 7 years old, for conversations and social interaction, they take turns to talk, listen and respond in two-way conversations and groups. They keep to a topic but are easily prompted to move on if it takes over. They copy others' language and begin to be aware of current peer language. For example, copies swear words, says cool or yeah, right. They use and experiment with different styles of talking with different people. At 7 to 9 years of age, for their attention, listening and understanding, they listen to key information and make relevant related comments. For example, so all mammals are warm-blooded, have fur or hair, and their babies all drink milk. They identify clearly when they haven't understood. For example, what's maize? Or get a blue what? They are able to infer meaning, reason, and predict. For example, it's getting very hot in here means open the window. At 7 to 9 years of age, for their vocabulary, they use a range of words related to time and measurement. For example, century, calendar, breadth. They use a wide range of verbs to express their thoughts or about cause and effect. For example, I wonder what she's thinking, or if we run, we should get there on time, but we might arrive late. They join in discussions about an activity using topic vocabulary. For example, I saw some chicken eggs hatching in the incubator on the farm last Friday. At 7 to 9 years of age, for their speech sounds, grammar and sentence building, their speech is clear. They use words with 3 sounds together or words with lots of syllables. For example, splash or string, rhinoceros or identical. They use regular and unusual word endings. For example, walked or fell. They use complex grammar and sentences to clarify, summarize, explain and plan. For example, so the bee collects the pollen from the stamen and then flies to another flower and pollinates it. At 7 to 9 years of age, for verbal storytelling and narrative, their stories have a good structure with a distinct plot, an exciting event, a clear resolution and a conclusion. For example, and everyone got home safely, which was great. They use intonation to make storytelling and reports exciting and interesting, and they add detail or leave information out according to how much is already known by the listener. At 7 to 9 years of age, for conversations and social interaction, they use formal language when appropriate in some familiar situations, for example, showing a visitor around school. They understand conversational rules, for example, looking at the listener to judge feedback or giving more detail if needed. They use tone of voice, stress on words, and gestures naturally to add meaning. They use language for the full range of different reasons, for example, complimenting, criticizing, negotiating. At 9 to 11 years, for their attention, listening, and understanding, they sustain active listening to both what is said and the way it is said. They follow instructions that are not familiar. For example, put the stripy folder that's on top of the cupboard into the bottom drawer of my desk. They understand different question types. For example, open, closed, or rhetorical. They understand simple jokes and simple idioms, but can't really explain why they are funny or what they mean. For example, you can't have your cake and eat it. At 9 to 11 years, for their vocabulary, they make choices from a wide and varied vocabulary. For example, leap instead of jump, terrified instead of frightened. They use sophisticated words, but the meaning might not always be accurate. For example, my bedroom was meticulous. They know that words can have two meanings and use them appropriately. They can't always explain how they are linked. For example, hard, a rigid object, and tough person. At 9 to 11 years, for their speech sounds, grammar, and sentence building, they use long and complex sentence structures. For example, I will come with you only because it means you will stop going on at me. They use questions to help conversations flow. Their sentences average about 7 to 10 words, longer in stories than in conversation, and they know when a sentence is not grammatically correct and can explain the rules of grammar. At 9 to 11 years, for their verbal storytelling and narrative, they tell elaborate, entertaining stories which are full of detailed descriptions. Their everyday language is detailed and not always about their immediate experience. They incorporate a subplot in telling stories and recalling events before resolving the main storyline, and they use complex joining words, for example, meanwhile or therefore. At 9 to 11 years of age, for their conversations and social interaction, they use different language depending on where they are, who they are with, and what they are doing. For example, formal style with the principal at school, relaxed and informal with family at home, and cool language with friends in the park. They communicate successfully, share ideas and information, give and receive advice, and offer and take notice of opinions. They realise when people don't fully understand, and they try to help them. For more information and advice, you can visit www.slcn.com.au. We've talked about the stages of typical development and maybe some examples of what you might see. But remember that children do develop at different rates, and it's sort of what's to be expected at different ages. But it might help you again in terms of thinking about whether your child or children you know are developing language skills as expected.